Welcome to ACCI's podcast, a space where we discuss how a movement of Australian Christians is working to transform communities and nations one life at a time.
Well, welcome to our ACCI podcast, One Life at a Time. Today, I am joined by Rebecca Windsor at AOG World Relief in Vietnam. My name's Katrina, and I'm one of the board members of ACCI, and we are going to have a great chat today about what missions look like when you are preaching the gospel without words, or sometimes using words, as that famous quote tells us. Hey, Beck, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. It's afternoon my time, but it's morning your time.
Good morning, Vietnam.
Good morning, Vietnam. Yes, I'm glad we managed to get that in there.
It has to go in there. It's mandatory.
Now, I should say up front to our listeners and viewers today, in case anyone doesn't know, Beck is also my sister-in-law. She's married to my brother, Kelvin, and we're going to hear a bit more about that. So, this is also a bit of a check-in. Make sure you're doing okay, Beck. You are married to my brother. So, how you doing?
Doing good. He's feeding well. He's sleeping well.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, as I said, Beck, you're living in Vietnam with Kelvin, married to Kelvin, and you have two beautiful children. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what life looks like right now and what it looks like living in Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, we first moved when I took her baby brother with me to Vietnam. Early 2011 now, so it's been a while. And back then we were what we call single married. So it was just the two of us, and then over time made a beautiful little family here in Vietnam. We call them our made and raised in Vietnam babies. So life is beautiful, life is full. For us, we are directors of an INGO here in Vietnam. So for those that don't know, instead of just being a bunch of alphabet thrown together, that's an international non-government organization. So that's the visa that we have here, which gives us the opportunity to be here and do this.
And probably a good comparison for those who maybe aren't aware is it's like running a kind of your version of, say, something like a World Vision or a Compassion, in which you're able to practically assist so many people in the country. As a non-government organization. But you actually, you talk about how you moved over with Kelvin just after you got married, but you actually were living in Vietnam at the time that Kelvin met you. So you actually moved there on your own as a single woman. Talk to us about that. Why did you move to Vietnam such a young age? You were in your 20s.
Yeah.
You were living in Sydney and living with your parents, growing up in Sydney, and next thing you know, you're heading off to Vietnam. How did that come about? What was the transformation or the things that changed in your life that made you decide, I want to pack up my life and I want to move to a country like Vietnam?
Yeah, it goes right back to even when my parents were pregnant with me. They were part of a local church, and one day the pastor felt God talking to them, and they had a prophecy over me, and they laid hands on me, and they had said to my parents, specifically to Mum, you are Hannah and this is your Samuel. You're raising this child to release this child. And so it was, very known right from back then that I was in Australia for a finite period. And obviously growing up hearing those stories, think exciting, but also pressure. What does that look like? And curiosity. But before I was even a kindergartner, I had come to my parents on Christmas Eve, climbed onto their bed and said, I want to ask Jesus into my heart. I want him to be a forever friend. So at a very young age, I was already quite aware of God and wanting him, to be part of my life and directing that path. And around that same time, my parents they saw this ad in the newspaper, and it was these two American missionaries who had come from the States down south, deep south, and felt called to plant a church in the western suburbs of Sydney. So it's a very low socio-economic area. At least it was back then. It's very not now. But they felt God say, leave where you're at. My mum was full-time on staff at a large church now, back then, and yeah, God said, go support them, generations count on it. So they moved, and a few months later they had their first missions conference, which was a backyard barbecue in the middle of winter. So very well thought through. But they had this pastor from Indonesia come.
Right.
And just one speaker. It was just this one backyard dinner, and I could tell you his name. We've stayed in touch over the years, but he just spoke so passionately. I hardly caught a word he said because he spoke so fast and with such passion. And but I just remember thinking, I want to go to places like that, and I want to do stuff like that.
How old were you at the time?
So I had just hit 4 and a pinch.
Wow, so very young.
Very young. And a lot of people, when they hear this, they struggle with the fact that at such a young age I could make a conscious, cognizant choice for Jesus, or know what little you can understand at that age. I want to do that. But that's my story. So for me, it was always, okay, this is the direction I know. Like, in the end, the gospel, preach the gospel, make disciples. The end. We as humans, we overcomplicate things, but that's our 2 mandates. And so I knew that from a young age to whatever understanding I had. And it was always a matter of where I was going and when. And so I felt a draw to Asia because I'm short, got dark hair. And that was, the first pastor I was introduced to. So I just got involved with a lot of volunteering at church, because the pastors I was blessed to be raised and spend the bulk of my ministry time in Australia under was, before you go, you better be doing it in your own backyard. And so heavily involved in volunteering, mission trips, travel, all of those things, but just none of them resonated with me. I did my first degree in Asian studies, very specific, went on lots of mission trips, but it was just like, this is not it. And so I was invited on the full-time ministry team at that church. It was just in our staff meeting, one lunch. Our pastor was sharing the vision for the year ahead and missions that they were going to start supporting. And they talked about Vietnam. My heart stopped and was like, that's the one that you've waited 20 years for.
So at that moment when you heard the name Vietnam, something resonated in your spirit.
Yeah. It was... I'm not saying it was one of those like Elizabeth moments, when John leapt up in her womb, it was like, and this amazing thing. It was just that simple. Yeah.
I love that. And yes, Asia is good for us more petite statured people, which is myself as well. Wonderful to feel, I think God works it out, doesn't he? He knows where we find our people. So you had this call at a young age, at an age where really most kids are thinking, well, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a teacher, I want to be whatever's in front of them. But I do love that idea, because often children at that age pick what they see on TV, they see what they're exposed to. And obviously your parents were passionate about missions and had been engaged in that. And you did see missions. So I think that is an encouragement to us, those of us who are local pastors, building families here in Australia or wherever else you're listening, that what we do actually show and exemplify and present, that our children pick up on that, and that we can be raising the next generation who feel called to go to the mission field just by exposing people to the heart of missions. And as a church, it is more than just giving to missions, isn't it? It's also exposing our young people, teaching them to have that heart. So you found that, you felt that call, Vietnam, your Elizabeth moment. And so you headed over to the mission field then on your own as a single girl. Just a side note question, because maybe there's young people who are listening right now thinking about going to the mission field. Did you ever think to yourself, making that choice, that life choice of leaving Australia to go to Vietnam, work on the mission field, and bearing in mind that our ability to travel has changed significantly since you left. It's a lot easier now. But did you think to yourself, that really does potentially limit my chances for other things, meeting a future spouse, other things that you would have on your heart to do? Did you feel like you really were saying yes. Did you have in the back of your mind that you were also saying no to other things, or did that not factor in?
I would have to say yes, like, because again, like I was full-time in ministry at church, particularly in youth ministry. Young adults, I was a chaplain in school as well as in the missions department. So, you know, like I'm hanging out with young people and knowing the kinds of things my peers are talking about and, you know, what their big life moments are. Essentially, what are we going to eat that day? Where are we going to go on holiday? You know, big problem. And then, you know, just being like, okay, this is it. So, you know, from that moment that I was like, yes, I want to go, I was on a plane to India for a couple of week mission trip. Then I was back for 2 weeks. And then my pastor was like, before you get on a plane to actually move there, how about you actually go and spy out the land? And so I went for a couple of weeks, you know, just to meet the potential people that I'd be working with, heart to heart, do we even click? And so that was wisdom on my pastor's heart, to do that. And so I would encourage young ones, if you're hearing someone who's a bit older, give you some ideas on, hey, get a sense check, get a feel, listen, lean in. There's a reason for it. But definitely, my girlfriends, so I came to Vietnam for all of 3 weeks. 2 days later, after landing, I'm definitely moving here. I had just had my 23rd birthday. And so I was back for 11 weeks in Australia to sell everything and move. So it was a very quick turnaround. Yeah. But my girlfriend threw me a Tupperware shower. And you're like, that is a very weird thing to do. Because of the rat problem in Vietnam, because nothing seals, it was strongly suggested that I get Tupperware to put my food in or anything I really cared about. Praise God, I've still got most of the original Tupperware, and there are rat marks on some of them. But it was such a funny but practical way. And the girls, they wrote a letter in each of and put it in the Tupperware containers that they bought for me. And one of them wrote a poem. It's a ridiculous poem about I'm going to move away, have no choices, and wear a moo-moo dress all the time. And it was not until I read this silly poem from one of my friends that I even really thought about it. And then I started to think about it. But then, again, the same passion that kind of got me going in the first place, and it stirred the fire for 20-odd years after knowing, yes, I want to do this, to actually getting there. Because everyone thinks it's this romantic calling and up you go. Yes, I knew that I was going to move here, and it was an 11-week turnaround, but it was a 20-year journey to get there.
Yes.
But it wasn't until that little card that I saw it and really started to process some of those, I guess, costs. But I was encouraged by Paul, you know, and he lists in through his different letters some of the costs.
Paul as
in the Apostle.
New Testament, the Paul.
The Paul. And how, you know, he counted some of those costs, and you see some of Timothy, and it's like, if not for Christ, what's the point anyway? And so I know it sounds simplistic, but I said, well, if I trust that God has led me over 20 years to the place and positioning for such a time as this, then I trust him with whatever the rest of my story looks like. I'm going to trust him with my safety, trust him with provision financially, all of those things. I can trust him with whether I have a family or not, how that looks, how that evolves.
Yeah.
But it's a conscious choice.
And I think that's a great lesson for all of us, isn't it? Because you'd seen the faithfulness of God in leading and guiding you, and you'd had that Elizabeth moment, Vietnam, you'd had that moment as a young child, you felt stirred, you knew that God was faithful, and you've trusted him for other things. And this was it's much bigger, but another trust step.
Yeah.
And of course, as God often orchestrates things, you maybe your friends thought, other people thought you were closing doors on other opportunities. And I'm sure at different times you wondered, had you closed those doors? But thank God for missions trips.
Yeah.
Short-term missions trips, because my brother went on a short-term missions trip, and
4 days.
Here we are.
It took 4 days.
And your long-distance relationship began. And now you live there, and you've been living there for a number of years. And of course, you run an NGO, and it's called AOG World Relief. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like. What is the work that you do, and what does your day-to-day look like?
So our organisation, so we are connected with ACCI. Obviously, we're like one of their little organisation babies around the world, but the name from back in the 90s has remained, and that was specifically because the Vietnamese AOG asked Australia and their global partners, how can we do mission and show that we are Jesus, that we are love in a closed access nation. And so we were kind of founded as one of those pilots of doing mission in a restricted access country. And
can I just rewind a little bit, Beck, because it's probably a good point for us to just stop and talk about what Vietnam is like as a nation, just to give a bit of context before we dive back into what AOG World Relief does. Tell us a little bit about the government structure of Vietnam and what life is like for its people.
Yeah. So Vietnam is a communist nation. So I know Vietnam's on the top list. I think it's top 10 nations to travel to as a tourist destination. You see all the sandy beaches. And it is ridiculously good, gorgeous, like green, lush, all of that. But politically, it is a communist nation. So, it is a socialist republic. So that means that there are stringent controls. And officially, true communism, there should be no religion. It should very much be atheist. But again, Vietnam, since the Vietnam War, that it's only newly an official communist nation as a country, because previously there were civil wars, two parts of Vietnam and democracy and all of that. So very complicated history. And so there's a lot of lingering religion from different spaces and places throughout Vietnam that's still practiced, even though officially there should be none. But like other nations with a similar political structure, the reception for Christianity is somewhat different. And there's a lot of prohibition, shall we say, and restrictions on what can be said and done, particularly where we are located. So the two bigger capital cities, a lot more freedom because there's a lot more people, so it's a lot harder to police that. But where we are is actually the site of the first Christian church in Vietnam, where Christianity, the gospel, first came to Vietnam, which is why we were first founded here, because it's also currently the most challenging, rich with growth opportunity area.
Oh, I like that. Yes, yes. And so obviously there are other churches, and you have the AOG church set up there. So, so part of that was the link to calling the NGO AOG World Relief. And tell us what kind of work do you do under the banner of AOG World Relief? Yeah.
So we are a community-led development organization. So people go, what on earth does that mean? So we focus on development as well as emergency relief and aid. Obviously, COVID, very busy. But community-led, meaning we actually connect with people in their communities, not just, hey, what are your needs, and let us fill them, but how can we help you help yourself?
Great.
That's actually biblical. Not that we've got the cash, you've got the need, let's partner together, because that comes across as very arrogant. And very, unfortunately, very colonial. A lot of colonialism right there. So just coming alongside people, how can we equip you? How can we work alongside? So in essence, if you were to sum up everything we do in four main ways, it's rural development and income generation to help families provide for themselves. It is medical assistance and healthcare or health interventions, mobility aids, heart operations, upgrading medical facilities, working with the Department of Health to be able to do those things. Education and training, a lot of child advocacy. Child rights is still an emerging space in Vietnam, and particularly with COVID going online, a lot of child protection issues, online safety, as well as our fourth area. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's essential, is building relationships and collaboration with stakeholders, because in Vietnam nothing happens without relationship. And a lot of people think development's got to be grassroots, just natural, go past. You don't need the leaders and the hierarchy. Sounds beautiful, but in a communist space, that's not realistic at all. And it's a recipe to be here for all of 5 minutes. You need to reach and be intentional and wise about hitting each space, different levels, different tiers, and working with all of them on the journey of development.
I like that, and I want to pick up on a couple of things you've just said, because you talked about working with the people, and not just asking what do you need, but also how can we help you help yourself. So that's one layer. I think the other layer is, though, that you also talk to key stakeholders and community leaders. And as you said, sometimes the thought could be that we bypass any kind of hierarchy, but really there are these two kind of fundamental aspects to what you do in terms of the way that you relate to people, which is quite, it talks about sustainability. We're looking now at how do we sustain the work that we begin, because when you meet a need, that immediately meets the need. But what we're talking about here is how do we come up with solutions that are actually going to help people long term, not just short term. So helping people help themselves, but also navigating those relationships with key stakeholders. So tell us a little bit about that. Talk to us about how do you build relationships firstly at a grassroots level in the community, so that you can have the kind of relationship where people come to you and say, this is what we need, can you help us help ourselves?
I guess in the simplest way, the two cannot exist without each other. Like we have to have conversations in both those spaces.
Yes.
And because of the way Vietnam is structured, there's a lot of layers and controls and things. So often we'll go to a community and we'll go as a whole team. We believe team. All of us have our different part. So that some of us can be having those conversations with the decision makers, ultimately the ones who have the bulk of the authority for a whole community. Because you're talking on average, a community that we'll work with, we say community, but it's actually a commune, but it just, people picture all these hippies and flowers, and it's not helpful. But we're talking an average of 10 to 15,000 in a particular community. So it's a lot of different needs.
Significant then.
It's substantial. And so again, as a community-led organization, you have to have the space to be able to differentiate between what Sally needs on the left with her family and what, Tang on the right needs, and be able to differentiate for those who are vulnerable, who are marginalized, who are being overlooked. So we have those key conversations with stakeholders. So, having coffees, lunches. In Vietnam, a lot of decisions are made around food and just time together. And you can't schedule that in an email and message trail. That doesn't get done with here's my 10-point plan. It takes time. And, in Western culture, it's like, no, I can, in an hour, I can sort out 20 different issues with these emails. But in Vietnam, some things happen very slow and other things happen very fast. So prioritizing coffee, prioritizing those lunches to sit down and have those conversations. But we'll also have the rest of our team with us. And if they're not having those lunches and coffees with those key stakeholders, they're having them with other key stakeholders who are the mums, the dads. They're walking through the community. They're able to have those conversations, as we continue walking, and some of us are with the leaders up the front, and they're having conversations on the side. So if we work together, it can be beautiful. And so that's an intentional core value that we have as a team. And it's listed right there on our front wall when you walk through our organization, that we believe in collaboration, we believe in connection, and we will work on it at all costs, because again, it's not sustainable without it. And then that allows us to be able to, through the strong relationships with the leaders, to build a currency of trust and respect, of knowing that we have their best intentions at heart, that we will find creative ways that other organizations aren't using or doing, and we'll be able to help meet needs that no one's either identified before or really been able to meet those particular needs. And so that's a beautiful gift. We don't always get it right, and we always want to be able to do more, but it is a gift and something we value very strongly to be able to do, because our vision is ultimately to pursue justice, and we chose that word very carefully because it's biblical justice in so many spaces and what that encompasses, by empowering people to transform their communities. So you've got to be connecting with the people. They are key stakeholders too, not just because they don't have the title, but they're the ones who are actually being the change in their community.
And you talk about biblical justice, and you talk about the fact that justice is biblical, but I also love that the model, this sustainable model of care that you've produced, which involves spending time around food and getting to know people in the community, key stakeholders, building relationships. Isn't that also a biblical model of how Jesus operated? Exactly. That some things happened quickly and some things took time. But it always happened over relationships. There were so many meals. There were so many of those moments, those key moments celebrated in that kind of moment of intimacy, moment of building relationship is what Jesus did. It's how he operated. And it's still how we are seeing the gospel being preached around the world.
Absolutely.
Which does lead me to a question. If you could share a little bit for us, Beck, because I alluded to it earlier. Really, your calling in Vietnam is to preach the gospel using words if necessary. And often you're not using words, but you are using actions. But it is the gospel in action. That's a different thing to navigate compared to, say, another couple or another family that's based in a nation where the government is open to churches being planted and evangelistic outreaches, projects and concerts and what have you, however it looks, where we're open to all of those expressions. But then you are in a nation that there is some challenges, and you've got to navigate how you express the gospel. How have you navigated that in a way that you've kept those relationships and continue to build relationships with key stakeholders?
Yeah, I would say it's ongoing, and we have to, I guess, for my husband and I, constantly guard ourselves against comparison, because you hear those stories where people were able to do X, X, and X. You're like, oh, we'd love to do that. Oh, what we're doing, it's not that. And you think of where people want to support, they want to, here's all the numbers of those who are saved. Here's all the numbers of people who are filled with the Spirit, and all of those things. And sometimes, I'm not going to lie, it can be depressing.
You don't have those stats.
We can't do that. But at the same time, if we remember our mandate in the first place, which is to pursue his justice and promote pathways to equality in every sense of the word, true holistic development, and just keep being open to what he's doing, then we're less likely to compare or less likely to want to eat a lot of ice cream, because we can't do that. But exactly like St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. And for us, I guess it's not either or, but it's using wisdom and discretion with when and how. And so again, that's why we believe in local development, community-led development, because we can be the coming alongside a community with here is your needs, help them identify resources or training, get them kind of started, bolster, families with income generation, etc. But then we can connect them with wisdom, how should we say this, with those who could come alongside them in truly holistic ways, shall we say. Yes. We do that, but we have to use it with great wisdom and discretion, hence why sometimes we'll have conversations with key stakeholders and leave others to have other conversations.
Yes.
And then we see fruit, like in one particular community, we led a community development workshop with last year, just helping them journey, challenge the idea of aid, relief, and what true development actually is. And then this leader, head of the community, one of the vice chairman, said, we need to connect with the local church. They're there, they're out there doing it. We need to get them involved. They need to be part of this table.
Wow.
And just like mic drop, like we were just
Wow.
floored that he said, but again, it takes time. And a lot of time, as humans, we're impatient. We want to see the fruit. We want to see the results. We want to have those statistics, those numbers. But a lot of what we do here is very much Matthew. It's the parable of the sower and just trusting that it's going in good soil and just continuing on doing. But I'm reminded also in Matthew where we're reminded, the kingdom of heaven, it's near. Like, go heal the sick, raise the dead, all of those things. The gift that you've received freely, give it. And ultimately it comes back to love. God is love. And so our mandate is love in action. And there is nothing that God cannot do. And if he is love, there is nothing that love cannot do. And so ultimately, we've got to trust that love in action, whatever that looks like, in whatever space with whatever child or family, whatever that looks like, love ultimately for many will be the sermon that the only sermon perhaps that they ever hear. They may not set foot in a church, but they can see Jesus. Yeah.
And I do love that. I love that that's your approach. You said earlier, it's not either or, it's both. And I think that's so key, that sometimes we think that we have to choose between the two. I also think it's a great encouragement for us living in Western countries. And, one of the conversations that we're having right now in those Western spaces is around freedom of religion, the different governments and different things, different policy changes that is making things very challenging for Christians at times. And certainly there's a concern and maybe at times even a fear of, well, in schools, what can you say and what can't you say? In public spaces and workplaces, what can you say and what can't you say? And I love that because it's a missional model. It's a model that we can all follow. And it goes back really to a passage that I've been studying in my own personal time, and I studied a bit about the prophet Jeremiah, and in Jeremiah 29 Jeremiah writes to the exiles and he writes to them and he says, and they're living in Babylon, they're not in a place where there's freedom of religion, but he writes to them and says, build houses and raise your families and your children and your children, and then he says to them, and seek the peace of Babylon. That they were called to seek the peace of that city in which they were placed. They were placed there not by their own desires, like you were. You went willingly; they went unwillingly. But there was a call and a mandate to be the light in a place that at times would have been hostile and at times would have been challenging. And so, isn't that the same mandate for us?
Yeah.
Vietnam, Australia, Western nations, whatever the challenges are, ultimately the same challenge is, as you said earlier, make disciples, preach the gospel, be that light, seek the peace of our city, and ask for the wisdom of the Holy Spirit as to how that looks. What it looks like in every context is different. Yeah. And so what's some of the takeaways that you have I guess learnt and appreciated after being there for now quite a few years, almost 20 years, not quite, almost 20 years on the mission field. It's clocking up, a long time going there. What are some takeaways if someone's looking at maybe venturing out to the mission field like you were? What are some takeaways that you've learned from living on the mission field, living in a very different environment, learning to preach the gospel, using words if necessary? Could you give us 3 takeaways?
Well, this isn't a takeaway. This is if you're interested, definitely do it. To pinch off Nike, just do it. I know it's not that simple, but lean into that call. Many are called, but you take up that call and do it. I guarantee it will be the wildest, in the best sense, faith ride that you will ever go on. Like, nothing will ever satisfy. Once you've had that stirring, you can't go back. But 3 takeaways. I would say ask lots of questions, because we can all go in thinking, even if you think I'm very humble and I'm not going in with my preconceived ideas. No matter how much you think that's where you're coming from, you've still spent however many years in a particular culture, in a particular context, in a particular church, a way of doing things. And that's all wonderful and beautiful and great for your experience. But when you go into a different space or place, not only are you bringing the kingdom culture with you,
Right.
but you are bringing, for better or worse, the rest of that with you too. So I would just encourage you to ask lots of questions, to listen widely, and resist comparison. Theodore Roosevelt famously said, comparison is the thief of joy.
Absolutely.
If you're comparing what you're doing in X space with what you used to do, or how it was done back home and back in my church or back in my da-da-da, you're going to be miserable, and you're going to make everyone else around you miserable too. And you don't want that. I would also say, pray about everything.
Oh, that's great.
As a family, we have, I wish you could see it, it's on the wall opposite me, our family code. And we've had this for more than a decade now. And the very first thing is God comes first, and the last thing is pray about everything. So I would have those as my other two takeaways. God comes first. Not trying to fit God into the mold or to the government requirements or whatever that structure is. Remember that first love and don't lose it.
Yes.
Because many times, I'm not going to lie, things are going to go pear-shaped, and it can feel overwhelming and just like, what's the point to any of it? But if you remember your first love and that call, it will carry you through any storm.
Well,
And pray about everything. You cannot over pray. You can never over communicate with God.
Yes.
And praise him too. It's not either or. But yeah, praise about everything. Like,
yeah.
You can't outpraise God.
Absolutely. I love that. Well, thank you so much for your time, Beck. It's always wonderful to catch up, but this time we caught up and everyone else gets to listen in. So thank you for your time. And to those of us who are joining today, thank you so much for listening. We hope this has encouraged you and stirred you. If you would like to know more about going on the mission field or partnering with the wonderful work of ACCI, why don't you head to our website, acci.org.au. Thanks for your time. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of One Life at a Time. To play a part in making a difference or to find out more about ACCI's impact across the globe, visit acci.org.au.